Hello, I'm Randy Lowry. I have the great privilege of being the president of Lipscomb University, and this is Lowry on Leadership. It's a wonderful privilege today to welcome to our studios and to our campus NAKI OSUTEI. Is that correct?
That's perfect.
A wonderful name that has its genesis in Africa and a heritage there that you have brought to Toronto, Canada, which is where you live now and have come from to the Lipscomb campus. Is that correct?
That's correct.
We're thrilled to have you today, and we're thrilled to learn about what is a distinguished career in civic leadership and what is a real vision for community, perhaps in ways different than some of us experience it and live it. But before we get there, let's go all the way back, okay? Let's go all the way back to your homeland and begin there to tell us your journey to Toronto.
Well, I don't know too much about my time in Ghana in West Africa, but we moved to Toronto when I was just turning 2.
So what you know is probably what people have told you.
Yeah, so there are these kinds of transplanted memories. So my mom always tells me the story of me being a 1-year-old and waiting for my dad at the door very anxiously, and there was a song that I would sing that would signify that he was on his way. And so she sings that song to me, and I feel like it's my own memory, but it's certainly not.
Wonderful.
It's interesting how much my heritage, how many connections I see from my heritage to the work that I do today. One of the big things that my dad tells me about his journey to Canada is how important networks, the role of networks in his life. And that's certainly something I see in the work I do today. He tells me that so many of the opportunities that he was able to obtain throughout his school life and leading up to his decision to move to Canada were developed because of the networks and relationships he had with people. He started off doing a lot of work around his student council and became a leader on his campus. And those relationships that he developed in those leadership roles were instrumental in helping him apply for citizenship in Canada.
So you really didn't have any choice about this,
no.
But it has blessed you richly.
It has.
But let's go back. Tell me what your name means.
NAKI means the firstborn girl.
The firstborn girl.
Which I am.
And I guess you are. Or were there others that were born after you?
My brother.
Your brother.
My brother, but he got a more majestic name. His name means chief.
Chief,
Yes.
Okay, interesting. Well, but you're still the firstborn girl.
Yes.
And so we moved from Africa to Canada at 2, and so you grow up in a country that has been a rapidly changing country during your lifetime. Tell us a little bit about childhood and school and life before now.
I'll tell you one interesting story, because we've been talking a lot today about the integration of skilled immigrants and diversity issues. And another story that my dad tells me is when he arrived to Canada, he had about, I think he says something like $200 in his pocket. And he found a hotel nearby the airport. And the next day, he knew he had to go out and look for a job. And when he went to, he's trained as an engineer, and he went to look for jobs in that field and was really coming up short. So he started looking at factories. So he went to a number of different factories. And the foreman at one of the factories said to him, "I'm looking at your resume. You are overqualified for this. Take 2 weeks. Go continue your search. Look for something in your field. If you don't find something, I guarantee you a job here at the factory."
Wonderful.
And it was his good fortune that he met that foreman, because it inspired him to keep looking in his field. Within 2 weeks, he found a job at an aerospace engineering firm, which allowed him then to sponsor my mom and I to Canada.
So you were still in Africa.
We were still in Ghana, yeah.
And now you get the signal.
We get the signal.
I have work, come.
Yes. And so we came and we moved into an apartment building, which there are many, thousands of high-rise buildings throughout Toronto, and many of them are homes for very, very low-income people, of which at the time I didn't know we were, but in retrospect I see that it was an area where many newcomers found their first home. And it was an incredible childhood. We lived on the 24th floor of that building.
Did you really?
And it was wonderful because my parents could look out the balcony and see my brother and I playing with the other children in the playground.
24 floors down.
24 floors
Whoa,
down.
Goodness.
And because there were so many newcomers, there was always an abundance of children in the neighborhood. So we had so much fun. I can remember you know, going down to the playground and playing soccer, baseball with the other kids in the neighborhood, and taking trips out to other nearby neighborhoods. So it was a really wonderful childhood, and I think in a lot of ways a very formative period for both my brother and I, in that we had opportunities to, and you know, when you're a little kid, you don't realize this is what's happening, but when you have such a large peer group within such a close proximity, you have opportunities to practice leading.
Right.
And I can see how those instances have shaped my leadership throughout my career.
Now, did you, at some point, either understand or feel like an immigrant? When was Canada your new homeland, and when were you a visitor still?
Oh, that's a really interesting question. Okay, I have to make a little confession. So my name is actually spelled N-A-R-K-I.
Okay.
It's still pronounced NAKI. But I remember when I started kindergarten, I was very shy and very much a tomboy.
Okay.
So I had my hat pulled down over my eyes, and I was this little kid. And the teacher comes up and sees the registration paper, says, "Oh, okay, NAKI, you sit here." And I didn't have it in me to correct her.
That wasn't right. You knew it wasn't right.
I knew it wasn't right. It's definitely not what my parents called me.
Sure.
But I just did not have it in me to correct her. And I think it's moments like those where I can imagine that if I was in a place where I felt more comfortable, I probably would have just, you know, stood up and said, "Oh, no, miss, my name is this."
This is.
But I didn't correct, and I didn't correct many people for years after that, until, you know, there was a point in time, perhaps in high school, where I started correcting people. And then it wasn't until after I got married that I actually changed the spelling of my name so it reflected the phonetic sound of it. But it's interesting. I think when I look back to that childhood period, as young children, you know, we always say that little kids don't see race, or they don't see difference. I think kids do. I think kids really want to fit in. I think all kids just want to, you know, they want to meet whatever the norm is in their minds. And it's when Facebook first came out, I started getting friend requests from people whose pictures looked really familiar, but their names were very different.
Right. So,
for instance, there was a girl that I knew her name was Monica growing up, but now her name was Manjeet. There was a guy named Dan, and his Facebook request said from Danada. And so it's almost as though there was this shift from when we were children, where we were all trying to assimilate, to now, where we're older and we're living in a society that's much more global, where we feel like we can reclaim ourselves again.
Interesting.
So there's definitely been a shift. It hasn't been so much a personal shift as much as it's been almost a macro shift in the way that societies view global culture.
Now, you didn't live in the high-rise forever,
no.
Right? There was a moment where living changed. Tell us about that.
Living changed, and this was in 1989, and the impetus for this was a movement among many of the other newcomer communities in the building. Home ownership is always, I think, a marker of success for newcomers. So
we would call that part of the American dream, except you're in Canada, so we can't call it that.
So it's the Canadian dream.
The Canadian dream,
yes.
Okay. Part of the Canadian dream.
And certainly that was true for the community that we were part of. There was a moment in time in 1989 where it seemed every person was moving out of the building and buying a house. And my parents felt the pressure, just as anyone would. And even though it might not have been the perfect time for them to buy a house, they decided to do it. They decided to make that move, and they purchased a house in a suburb about 20 minutes from where we were living.
Okay.
And when we got to that neighborhood, we thought, oh, this is just a great neighborhood. There's a college across the street. There are 4 different transit lines that cross, you know, just outside our door. But there was no middle school in the area, or no, what would the equivalent be here?
Middle school.
Okay.
Well, sure.
There was no middle school in the area, so I ended up being bused into another part of town, which was known as sort of a rougher part of the city. So the irony was, here we are trying to, you know, chase the Canadian dream, moving out of a lower income area to a more prosperous area, but then being bused in for school into another lower income area. But that was such a blessing for me, being part of the school community, because that is where I found my first summer job. Right across the street from my high school is a public housing complex called Jamestown. And there are a couple of community service organizations. And one organization put out a call for applications for summer students through a youth employment service program funded by the government. And I got a chance to work at this place, Thistletown Community Services Unit, as a community garden assistant. And I met the executive director of the organization, who definitely changed my life. She took me around the neighborhood and really gave me a history on Toronto immigration patterns by showing me where different communities had settled and the different contributions they had made to the neighborhood. And that experience really spoke to a role of community leadership and civic leadership. These people the people moving into the neighborhood saw their community as a place they needed to be a trustee over, not just an inhabitant of. And that notion of citizen as trustee has really stuck with me and has really shaped the way I view civic life and civic leadership.
So going to the suburbs, we thought that would be the perfect solution. The blessing really was going back into a different environment.
Absolutely.
And then going back there and finding this wonderful person who affects your life and begins to plant, I guess, in you a seed. Or maybe they were already there, but that began to blossom as you begin to think about community and people, and that then has led to some other things. Tell us about college real quick, and then we'll get to your work today.
Okay. My college experience has to be contrasted with my high school experience.
Okay.
So I went to a high school where the population was extremely diverse. Some of my best friends were from Turkey, from Lebanon, from Jamaica, from St. Kitts, from Guyana, and everything in between. They were probably maybe, of the 1,600 or so students, maybe 20 people who would be considered white.
Really? So very, very diverse.
Very, very diverse. I chose to go to a university in a more rural part of Ontario where these statistics were completely reversed. And
which for you might have then been the cross-cultural experience.
It was very much.
Right.
And I remember my parents dropping me off, and I thought, oh yes, I'm in university now, this is great. And they dropped me off to my residence, to my dorm, and they said, oh, we'll help you unpack. I said, no, you guys go home. I'll be fine. And I sat in that room and I thought, oh my gosh,
what
what am I doing here? I literally got on the bus and went back home.
Did you really?
The experience of that culture shock was so overwhelming that I just felt completely alone. I felt like I could not function, so I went home. And my parents did what they always do. You need to go back and deal with it.
You've got to go.
You've got to go. So they put me right back on the bus.
To go right back to the college.
Go right back. And there's an interesting photograph of me at my convocation where I'm standing there waiting to be called up to receive the diploma and to get the gown.
And we call convocation graduation, but that's what we're talking about,
that's
the end of your college experience.
That's right, where the cap and the gown, that whole end of experience. There's a photograph of me where I'm surrounded by what I call the blondes.
I've seen that photograph, and you are surrounded, right?
Yes, and that's very emblematic of my experience. But the interesting thing is, in that experience, there were a number of on-campus groups that catered to supporting students like me. So students who were coming from urban centers, students of color, students who will, for whatever reason, feel marginalized. And getting involved in those groups was a saving grace for me. In a couple of senses. One, it allowed me to create a community. Two, it allowed me leadership opportunities that I don't know I would have experienced otherwise. But the funniest thing about my university experience is that is where I really began to experiment with my identity. And I really began to freely be a different type of person. And I think that happens to anyone when you go away for school.
Sure.
But it's interesting how sometimes when you are in an environment where you're the majority, there's a certain standard that you're working to assimilate to.
Right.
Whereas when you are when you're a bit more on the fringe, you can play with your identity because you're on the fringe. Nobody really cares.
You're already there, right?
So I'm grateful for that experience, and whenever I any of the kids I mentor, I tell them, try and go away, get out of your comfort zone. I think as leaders, it's so important to intentionally put yourself outside of your comfort zone, because inevitably something incredible will emerge out of it.
One of our agendas at this university has been to be much more culturally diverse, and I think we are have the highest minority population of any university in Tennessee.
That's incredible.
About 16%, and that doesn't sound dramatic, but it's very dramatic compared to what it would have been. And I'm just absolutely convinced that that cross-cultural experience is going to be absolutely critical for the future of our young people as they go into the work world and take, I hope, with them some wonderful and positive experiences. So here you are, you graduate from college, and now we get to the career piece of this. And you're here at Lipscomb today because a group of Nashvillians went to Toronto, you know this, went to Toronto as part of a Chamber of Commerce trip, and you impressed them. And you impressed them with a sense of what's happening and your ability to describe it. Tell us a little bit about what you've done in recent years in terms of work, and a little bit about the passion that you have.
After undergrad, I did a couple of different jobs working with organizations that are focused on the arts, focused on culture, and focused squarely on the city. Then I went and did a master's degree in sociology, where I started looking at multiculturalism and marketing, and how businesses use cultural diversity in different ways. While doing that research, I began to do some consulting in and around the university, and was introduced to a woman who knew of an organization that she thought I might be able to add value to. And that organization at the time was called the Toronto City Summit Alliance. We've since rebranded as Civic Action. And that organization at the time was being chaired by this phenomenally dynamic man named David Pico, who at the time was a partner of the Boston Consulting Group, and had been able to mobilize a group of leaders from across sectors who saw a vision for a Toronto that they had never imagined. A Toronto that was different from the Toronto of their present.
Now this was not a long time ago.
This was in 2000, well, the organization began in about 2002.
So, I mean,
it's not a long time ago.
8 or 9 years ago.
That's right.
Okay, so now there's this realization in this community, and you're kind of right there at the moment that that's coming into play. And you said something a little bit earlier about just the makeup demographically of the city that gives us an opportunity to be pretty cross-cultural. Can you share that?
The Toronto region is home to 6 million people, and almost 1 in 2 people are foreign-born. So you can't go anywhere in the city without meeting someone whose experience is very similar to mine, or someone who has more recently immigrated to Toronto.
Right.
And certainly that presents a number of challenges, but some really huge opportunities.
So every other person you meet is from somewhere else. In terms of being born, you know, we talk about Nashville being diverse and are just now coming to grips with the fact that 1 out of every 7 people was born outside the United States, so we're not even close. So you're naturally in this laboratory, this cultural experience that is fascinating. And so what does the organization do?
So the organization, when it began in 2003, was primarily focused on the integration of skilled immigrants. So these are individuals who come to Toronto based on a certain skill set that they bring, educational attainment, professional attainment.
And is that a criteria for then being able to immigrate?
It is,
okay,
yes.
So the government's saying it's not everybody who we're going to allow to come. There are some skills, there are some areas of expertise. There's a way you're going to contribute when you get here.
Absolutely,
is that right?
Absolutely.
Okay.
And there's a point system that functions in relation to those criteria.
So now they're arriving.
And so now they're arriving, and when they arrive, that Canadian dream is outside of their reach because they cannot obtain that first Canadian work experience, which presents quite a barrier for so many of our newcomers. Now this reality was brought to the attention of the first group of leaders that met under the Toronto City Summit umbrella, and they felt that there was an opportunity to do something very, very specific to address this. Now the challenge that was very clear was that these newcomers were not able to obtain Canadian work experience because they don't have experience in Canada. So it's a vicious cycle. How do we cut into that cycle? Find find these newcomers work experience. So the organization that we set up was in partnership with a private foundation called the Maytree Foundation. And the organization was called the Toronto Region Immigrant Employment Council. And it exists today as its own entity. The Toronto Region Immigrant Employment Council, known as TRIAC, has 3 different initiatives that it runs. One is called the Mentoring Partnership. And this program was designed to really help newcomers understand the cultural nuances associated with work in Canada. So things like how you write a cover letter, the salutations that you use, how to network. The mentoring relationships are quite effective because anyone can be a mentor. If you've worked in Toronto, even for 10 years, you can be a mentor because you understand how the system works. So we've got a number of companies who are really encouraging their employees to do this as a leadership development for the employee, but also as a way of helping newcomers. The second is an internship program called Career Bridge that provides newcomers with that first work experience. Certainly they're working at a lower wage, and it's a 6 to 8 month internship, but it is that first foray into their field. And we have found that over 80% of people that go through this internship program are able to acquire jobs in their fields.
And we found that at the college level as well, because people get to know them, see their talent. They're not really taking the same kind of risk because of that familiarity.
Absolutely.
Great. So the third program?
And the third program is a program that is targeted towards human resources professionals in these organizations that are looking to hire skilled newcomers. And it provides them with resources that will help them hire in a way that is much more inclusive. So things like, one of the things that became very clear was that there were some biases associated with the name of the university that people attended. So when a resume was received and it said MBA from the University of New Delhi, it was viewed in a different way than an MBA from Harvard. And so one of the things that we recommend is taking a more blind approach to the resume. So you will see the credential, you don't necessarily see where the credential came from. And so then and in that way you're able to assess the different candidates based on their credentials, based on their experiences solely, instead of the additional filter that comes from seeing the name of the institution. So these kinds of recommendations are available at higherimmigrants.ca, a website that has been developed specifically to support HR professionals.
So how long did you work with this piece?
This particular piece predates my time with Civic Action, but it's an important piece that provides a foundation to some of the work that I have been involved in. In 2007, Civic Action hosted its 3rd summit. And at this summit, which was a gathering of about 700 individuals, we looked at 11 policy issue areas. And whether it was municipal finance or animating our waterfront, the people in the room kept going back to the same refrain. They continually said, the leadership in this area is in no way reflective of the diversity of our population. And that set off a light bulb for our organization. It told us that here's an opportunity to do something very special. So we went to the same partner with whom we developed TRIAC, the Regional Immigrant Employment Council, and we decided that we were going to develop a set of programs that were focused on accelerating the diversity in leadership. We identified the problem as being a diversity deficit, and we wanted to turn that into a diversity dividend that the entire region could benefit from.
So the community is diverse.
The community is diverse.
And we have this immigrant population that's coming in that's well qualified, highly skilled, ready to participate, but the leadership doesn't reflect that. Is that right? That's
correct. And in addition to the newcomer immigrant population, there's a population of people that are similar to me, who I call the 1.5 generation. So these are folks who weren't born here necessarily, but they've grown up here their whole lives.
That's right. It's home.
And for some of the people in that circumstance, finding opportunities in leadership is just as difficult as it is for a newcomer, and that really shouldn't be the case.
So what did you do? What's the key here?
So two major elements. One, we did quite a bit of consultation. So we consulted with established leaders in the corporate sector, in government, in non-for-profit organizations, and asked them how they saw this problem, and asked them what they thought could be interventions. One of the common responses we received was that we really needed to identify the problem clearly in a way that could be understood by the common person, but also to show for society how we're doing. So certainly, anecdotally, we can say, oh, I met a taxi driver who has a PhD. And someone could easily argue, okay, well, that's just that one guy. Or you could say, oh, I know this person who went to public school in Toronto, has a university degree, and still isn't able to find a job. Oh, well, it's just that one person. What we did was we did a scan of the research in the area of diversity and leadership. We partnered with a major research institution to do that, the Conference Board of Canada. And we looked at the business case for diversity and leadership as a first step. The second step was we partnered with one of our universities, Ryerson University. They have a diversity institute. And we worked with them to develop a benchmark that tells us how we're doing insofar as the diversity and leadership at present in Toronto. And we found that in contrast to the nearly 50% diversity in the population, only 13.5% of the leaders of our largest organizations come from visible minority backgrounds.
So a lot of work to do.
A lot of work to do. And so we developed 7 initiatives that are targeted at accelerating that process. We know that over time, we'll see that balance occur, but we also know that there are economic and social benefits to be gained, and why wait for them? So we developed a series of programs. Some of them are focused on nurturing civic leadership amongst underrepresented communities. Others are mechanisms for boards to find talented leaders from diverse communities to sit on their boards. Others are related to the media. We saw that in media, people from marginalized communities are called upon only to speak about issues of immigration or race, but we've got experts in diverse communities who can speak to foreign relations or to the economy, but they're not called on as often. So we wanted to create a mechanism for media to access these individuals in a more seamless way. And so Diversity Voices is one of our initiatives that does that.
Let me take that and seek to understand, here's a diverse community, but your passion, your interest, your work has been to bring the leadership out of that. Let's have you be a consultant to us for a minute, okay? A community that is not quite as diverse, but is growing much more so quickly. What 2 or 3 things would you say to Nashville, Tennessee? Music City, USA, used to be called the Athens of the South. There are so many universities here, but we're probably, frankly, years behind some of the conversations you're having. What 2 or 3 things would you say to us as we look out into the future?
I would say there has to be a common vision. There's got to be something that your business leaders, your government leaders, your community leaders can all buy into. That's a starting point.
And that's the vision of a cross-cultural...
Of a cross-cultural, inclusive community. So a community where all people, irrespective of their, their socioeconomic background or the country of their birth, a society where they can all find their place and they can find a way to be who they want to be in it.
Sense of vision.
A sense of vision is definitely key. We, in our work with Maitri, we always we use a phrase called "what gets measured counts."
Okay.
So there's quite a bit of value in understanding where you're at today, and then attaching to your vision some metrics as to where you want to be.
So measuring the reality today and measuring as we go forward.
Absolutely.
And that's where your 13% becomes really significant. You have something to talk about then.
Exactly, and you also have a mirror. And the third thing I would say is look for the practical interventions. And some of these interventions will only have they will only create incremental change, but that incremental change eventually adds up to significant change. So you take for example, the mentoring partnership that I mentioned earlier. It's a very practical, simple intervention. And by no means is that going to completely reconstruct the immigrant experience, but it definitely does provide some point of entry for an individual. So I would say talk to the communities that you're trying to work with, and out of those conversations will emerge the solutions that you need. But I think you want to be looking for those really simple interventions that will have impact in an incremental fashion.
Wonderful. Well, we're almost out of time, but I'm thankful you were the firstborn daughter in a faraway place, but have had a life of change and a country that welcomed you, a career now that is influencing the community, and I'm sure you're just really, really getting started. So thank you for working hard today. You've been in front of 3 different groups, several hundred people. Thank you for doing that, and thank you for doing this video that will be on our website and be seen by an untold number of others.
Thank you very much
and
for
may you
having
be
me.
blessed in what you're doing with your vision and your passion and your safety.
Thank you.
And that's Lowry on Leadership. We appreciate you tuning in and watching, participating in these conversations. We hope that from that it won't be a passive experience, but that you will have a glimmer of hope, that you will have an idea or two, and that you too will be a part of improving our communities.